Jamie, Jaime, Jeffrey, Arish, Ari. I don't know. We're trying new intros here. Well, Arish.
Arish.
I do introduce myself in Spanish as Arish because I feel like it does work better. So I guess that is my
I always say
alter
mi amo
ego
jefe,
there.
so that
There
works.
you go. There you go. Perfect. Well, how are y'all doing today?
It's Friday. Couldn't be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sunny Friday in Columbus, Ohio. Couldn't be better.
There you go. That's actually a good transition to our icebreaker of today. Jamie tried to ask me what the icebreaker is going to be before the meeting, and I refused to say. It's got to be.
I don't think there's a rule or even a norm around disclosing what the icebreakers are.
No.
It's supposed to be like shocking,
right? But all right. So when y'all close your eyes and think about a summer day, what like a nice you're not working, a good summer day, what comes to mind? Is it a day at the lake, the pool, like at the house with the family? Like what do y'all think of? We're in the middle of the summer, so either of y'all can start.
Our questions are going to be so different, Jamie, or our answers.
Start us off, Jeff.
Yeah, so for me, I love being at the lake or being at a creek or a river, like swimming in non-ocean body of water, being from the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. It's kind of in my blood. So a nice day at the lake, with my girlfriend, with the dogs, maybe go on like a long hike, and then, get in bed pretty early, get worn out during the day and then lay on the couch in the evening and maybe have a good movie or something. End it with a nice bourbon.
I like it. What about you, Jamie? Is that similar?
I think about the beach, but the reality is, like, what I really think about is having to watch my kids all day because they're not in school. So that's kind of what, after you have kids, you start to associate summer not with freedom, but with just having to keep an eye on your kids or pay out the nose for summer camps.
That's funny. I always made the joke, after graduating college, that seasons kind of become less of a thing when they're in the stage of life before you have kids and after you're done with school. Because it's just I can take time off whenever. I don't have a summer break. But then when you have kids and when you're in school, it's okay, now it's summer, they're out of school, or here's the spring semester, here's the fall semester. So it's interesting kind of how that changes in different periods of your life.
Yeah, the other thing that happens is time seems to compress. Like the older you get, the faster it goes by. And someone explained it to me as when you're 5, a year is 1/5 of your life. But when you're 40, a year is 1/40th of your life. So by comparison, it just flies by.
That's awesome. Yeah, I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is a rule that I have learned stays absolutely true. The older you get, the faster time goes. Unfortunately, my parents were 100% accurate on that.
Well, they say time flies when you're having fun. So I guess when you're getting older, you're just having more fun. Is that
and they say life's
correlation,
a blast.
causation?
So there you go. That all works out. That's squared up.
There you go. Well, we have an awesome episode today talking about cryptocurrency, getting a much needed update. And it's been a couple of months since we've talked about crypto. So there's been a lot of changes in the space, but let's just get into it.
Hello, and welcome to Map Your Money, a finance-focused podcast. We exist to simplify the lives of our clients and listeners and to help individuals create the roadmap for their financial future. Calls are pre-screened and the content was pre-recorded. Please note that the content presented is for educational purposes only. We encourage you to consult a financial advisor or conduct your own due diligence before making any investment decisions. All information provided is believed to be reliable but is not guaranteed for accuracy or completeness. This presentation does not constitute investment, legal, or tax advice, nor an offer to buy or sell any security or insurance product. It also does not endorse any third party or their views. All examples are hypothetical and for illustrative purposes only.
So wanted to start our episode today giving a quick crypto market update, what's been happening with Bitcoin, Ethereum, the overall market. Jeff, do you want to kind of jump in here and kind of fill us in on what's going on?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, we've been bullish as a firm on Bitcoin and Ethereum for quite a while. Jamie actually, really led this effort in mid 2022. And after the new Bitcoin spot ETFs were announced on January 11th, 2024, we became more bullish. And so we've actually seen that continued this year as well. Bitcoin's up 29% year to date. Ethereum's underperforming. It's only up 3.6% year to date, but it's actually rallied quite a bit over the last 3 months, up 119% in that time because of some of this new legislation and developments in the crypto space that we're going to talk about. So the crypto environment is alive and well. It's continuing to deliver really good returns for investors. It's also delivering returns and, still pretty interesting environments and providing that diversification hedge against fiat currency, which I think is becoming kind of more and more headline news lately, especially given some of the pressure on the Fed to cut rates. And then, really interesting stat about kind of why this is happening, why Bitcoin continues to increase. Since the spot Bitcoin ETFs were released on January 11, 2024, those products have bought a cumulative amount of 654,000 Bitcoin, but only 290,000 new Bitcoin have been created. So we're continuing to see that the issuance of the ETFs and now some new institutional players getting in on this is creating a lot more demand for Bitcoin than the underlying supply. And again, the supply is fixed and the new supply continues to decrease every time there's a halving event.
Interesting. Yeah. And just to give the mappers a little bit of context, Jaime, if you don't know, we call our listeners mappers now. We needed something that was
all seven of them.
Yeah. All
17
to eight now.
8 now. Cause I'm on the podcast. Right.
There you go. But to give the mappers some context, the spot Bitcoin ETF, we've talked about it in prior episodes, but it's what allows like retail investors and institutions to more easily purchase these asset classes because you can buy them at traditional custodians like Charles Schwab, like Fidelity, like Vanguard, and Raymond James. I can go on and on. But we have a whole episode on those. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out as well. But Jaime, what are kind of your thoughts on what we've seen with the appreciation in Bitcoin and Ethereum before we dive into the legislation changes and everything else like that?
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is the largest, the most decentralized cryptocurrency. It's the most well-known, and it has a very specific use case. So it's really not surprising that it's behaved the way it has. I think Ethereum has been a little more surprising for the people who kind of know what's been going on behind the scenes. Ethereum really took a very long-term focus in its development roadmap, and I think ceded some ground to Solana and some other similar cryptocurrencies behind it. But it is still by far the largest and the most decentralized. And I think there has been some change in the leadership at the Ethereum Foundation, and they're sort of pivoting their time frame to a little bit more shorter term. But I think over and above that, part of the reason that you're seeing a bit of a resurgence in Ethereum is that, if we talk about stablecoins, which is going to be the topic today, stablecoins are on various crypto rails. They can be on any blockchain, but Ethereum is by far the largest, the most decentralized. So as you see the proliferation of stablecoins, Ethereum is going to be a large beneficiary of that, because being the largest, the most decentralized, the most secure of the blockchains, that's arguably where the largest stablecoin transactions are going to occur.
So what is a stablecoin?
Great question, because there's a lot of confusion around this topic. So a stablecoin is essentially a digital dollar on crypto rails. And you can think about it as each stablecoin has a real dollar backing it somewhere in a bank. And each of those stablecoins is redeemable for dollars, but it has all the benefits of crypto. So it means near instant settlement, low cost to transact, it's decentralized, and it allows for things that right now aren't that easy to be done fairly easily, like cross-border payments. And the two largest stablecoins right now, or the two that you hear about the most, are Tether and Circle. So Tether is the largest. It's primarily based outside of the United States. Circle is the largest that is US based, and Circle is really making a play to become like the US stablecoin.
What do you mean by US based? Like government backed, or just because I know it's all decentralized. So
Yeah, so this is where we start to get into like what does it mean to be a stable coin? How do you regulate them? That sort of thing. So government backed. In theory, all of these are backed by the U.S. dollar, right? There's a dollar held somewhere. When I say U.S. based, if you remember the in the prior administration where Gary Gensler was heading the SEC, it was a very unfriendly crypto environment. And there wasn't a lot of clarity on the rules. And what was happening was any of the crypto players inside of the United States they didn't know what the rules were. The good actors that tried to seek guidance would typically have a Wells notice. I mean, there was almost an all-out attack on crypto. So that created an environment where to be successful, you kind of had to be based outside of the United States. And that's what Tether did. They said, look, we're going to do this. We're doing it in dollars and with U.S. bonds backing this, but we're just going to do this outside of the United States. And that's what they've done. Whereas Circle has tried to build their product and their headquarters within the U.S. And now that, let's just say, the political tides in crypto have changed and it's a more favorable political landscape, they're really making a play to be like the preferred crypto among U.S. regulators.
Jaime, is that tied to I know we're going to talk about all the different pieces of legislation. There's one of the three pieces of legislation has to do with forbidding the Fed from making their own U.S. dollar stablecoin. Is some of that kind of circle back to make sure that they're entrenching themselves as one of the leaders from the start?
No, I would say that is separate from Circle, but this is all tangential. So what you're talking about is what's called a CBDC, or a central bank digital currency. And these two terms are often misunderstood. But one is a digital dollar that is decentralized, meaning nobody controls it. It can move freely around. Another one is a digital dollar that is created and controlled by the central bank or a government, or it's essentially a digital currency issued by a central bank. So if you think about that, it's centralized, right? The central bank that's issuing it controls the currency. They can create more of it. They can create less of it. They can monitor it, shut it down. This is what China has developed, is a CBDC. I would argue that a CBDC is not desirable. I mean, depending on the political jurisdiction, there's different countries toying with the idea. Occasionally this gets thrown around in Europe. China is developing one of these. But you think about what that means. A CBDC, it's essentially doing the same thing, but the difference is control. In one of these, no one controls it. In another one, a government controls it.
Why would
and
it
what
need
that
to
means
be
is
forbidden then?
Well, so let's think about what this means in the context of China, or really any central bank, right? So with a CBDC, they could track your spending. They could control what you could and could not spend money on. So there's, for example, let's say we issue government assistance to low-income people, and we might say, okay, you can spend this on everything except for junk food and alcohol and
cigarettes,
whatever the
what
government decides. Mm-hmm. Now, there could be positive uses for that, but I think most Americans would argue that that's just kind of a bridge too far in terms of freedom and oversight.
So
because the current system
before it starts.
Exactly. Now, you think about the context of that with an authoritarian government in China. The current system does have a certain amount of control. The government can freeze your accounts, but there's still a layer in between your money and the government. The credit card issuers, the banks, the government doesn't have access directly to that information. If they did, the level of control that a government could influence on people is, it's kind of scary. And in the US, we sort of take some of that for granted because we have generally a freedom-loving government, but that doesn't mean it couldn't go in that direction. And a really good example, and this is in the current monetary system, is in Canada, what happened with the Canadian truckers. They were protesting, blocking highways, and the Canadian government froze their accounts. And you think about that, that's really scary. I mean, that's something you'd think that like Putin is doing to his political dissidents. So a CBDC, while it gives the government a lot of tools that maybe could be beneficial, they can also really be misused. They can track your spending. They could, especially now with AI, they could really know almost everything about you, every penny that you're spending, and then they could control that. So you compare that with a stablecoin. A stablecoin's decentralized. I think that is much more aligned with American values. And by proliferating stablecoins, one of the things that we are sort of inadvertently doing is also exporting those values, and in particular, freedom to parts of the world that don't have the financial freedoms we do. So like an example would be, if you're a woman in Afghanistan, you don't have a bank account, and probably your husband or your father or someone else has all the financial control. Well, now you have the ability to save money on an app in your phone and flee the country, with that money. Or if you think about just a poor person in Venezuela under Maduro, where you just don't have the ability to save in U.S. bonds or in real estate because you're poor. Well, now you can buy fractional U.S. dollars, and you don't have to do it on the black market at a 20 or 30% discount.
So is the title of this episode "Stablecoins Equal Freedom"? I don't know.
We could title it different ways. I don't know what would be the most clickbaity, but I would go for that one.
I mean, I think there's a lot of people that, like, in the when I was a bank examiner, Jamie, a huge thing that we looked for all the time was AML procedures, anti-money laundering, and making sure that we knew the source of the funds that were being deposited, making sure that we knew the activity in the accounts and that wasn't suspicious. And there's all these reports on the back end that are reported, authorized, and required by the 2001 Patriot Act after the 9/11 attacks that do exactly what you're describing: monitor bank accounts, monitor transactions, shut down accounts, freeze accounts. They check the Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, for different terrorist lists and stuff. So it seems like, wouldn't a central bank digital currency solve some of those problems if maybe there was some other guardrails put around that? And is that something that stable coins actually make tougher for regulators that are, trying to operate in that environment and stop those activities?
Well, there's sort of two things that it's important not to conflate, right? Control and transparency. Anything on crypto rails is embedded on the blockchain for everybody to see. So it makes it really easy to track down illicit transactions and ultimately find them. And all of those crypto, let's just say money transactions, ultimately have entry points and exit points into the traditional financial system. And those choke points are still controllable by the government. A lot of the sort of high profile cyber attacks that happen in cryptocurrency, oftentimes a lot of that money is recuperated. It might not be right away, but all of those transactions are forever embedded on the blockchain, and it's only a matter of time till people pinpoint, like, where did the money go into the system, where did it come out, who benefited from it. That money's often recovered. And so I think that's no different with stable coins. But the key difference is the visibility and the amount of control that the government has just on day-to-day things, because a lot of what you're mentioning, it really pertains to large transactions. It doesn't pertain to someone spending $3 on a cup of coffee, or like really small transactions.
Right.
That
Nothing
really the
unusual
government just
about
hasn't.
that.
Exactly. And on top of the fact that a lot of those illicit transactions can happen in cash, and it's totally for the most part, it's untraceable. So like that, some of that doesn't go away. I think it's kind of like the ring of power in Lord of the Rings. Like, you'd rather just not have it not exist than give it to somebody that is going to say they're going to do good, but is also corruptible.
Yeah, sure.
Fair.
That's a fun analogy.
So I know you mentioned that it's easy to find illicit transactions if they're on the blockchain. How did the Silk Road exist then? That's the online crypto black marketplace.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's easy to find, but all of the information is there forever, right? So an investigator can find it. So the Silk Road is a good example. The Silk Road was an illicit website it was on the dark web, where people could buy basically anything bad you can think of. I think many people used it to buy drugs online, but there were far worse things for sale on the Silk Road. You could take a hit out against somebody. There was, I don't even know, human trafficking, prostitution, who knows? All kinds of bad things. And they would transact in Bitcoin. And it's kind of an ironic twist in a lot of ways, because that is one of the things that led to more Bitcoin adoption. And we're talking over 10 years ago, I think maybe 15 years ago, before most people even knew what it was. That's one of the things with people buying drugs on the internet that kind of started some of these early Bitcoin transactions. The irony is that this is the most traceable transaction you will ever have. And so when the government finally did track down Ross Ulbricht, all of this was captured on the blockchain. And there's a really interesting podcast with, I think her name is Katie Hawn? She was a former prosecutor for the federal government, and then later left and went to go work for, I think, Andreessen Horowitz managing their crypto division. But she was on the Silk Road case, and she talks about how, but for Bitcoin, they would never have been able to catch all these people. Now, this happens years after the fact, but the fact is those clues it's like they're embedded in amber on the blockchain, and they're there forever.
But anonymous, right? I thought like the idea was that they're traceable and trackable, and you have these ideas that you can track and trace, but the ultimate owner, the legal name, is not connected to that by any means.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're anonymous. There are some blockchains that are designed to be completely anonymous, and I do think that there is a real rational argument for why that is important. But blockchains are pseudonymous, meaning there is a web address, and or there's an address on the blockchain where you're sending and receiving transactions. Everybody can see it, and that is a unique address. So it's not necessarily tied to your identity, but it doesn't mean it can't be. Whereas an anonymity also implies that, you can't see who's transacting what and for what amounts, and that is not the case on the blockchain.
Interesting. Well, Jaime, I'll kick it to you, Jaime. Tell us about this Genius Act and kind of what the implications of this are.
Awesome. Well, so we went on a little bit of a tangent, but we ultimately want to bring this back to like normal people and what's going on in the United States, like not crypto nerds like me. So the Genius Act is a really important piece of legislation that it passed the Senate a couple weeks ago, and then it looked like it was stalled again. And we just found out yesterday it passed the House, and it's going to the president's desk for a vote. But it's essentially legislation to provide a framework for regulating stablecoins in the United States. So it's gonna outline things like, if you're gonna call yourself a stablecoin, what are the reserve requirements you have to have? How do they need it? How do you have to verify them? So if you're going to call yourself a stablecoin, what rules do you need to follow? So it's a very basic form of consumer protection, but it's something that is super important because it has so many knock-on effects. If the U.S. takes the lead on this, it'll set the standard for every other jurisdiction to do the same thing. And what we really want is just a clean regulatory framework, because as we talked about previously, the regulatory environment in the U.S. under the Gensler administration was, we don't know what the rules are, and you don't know what you did wrong until somebody shows up at your door and tells you what you did. And so there's a lot of great companies in the United States that are trying to abide by the rules, and we need to give them guidance. So, ultimately that's what the Genius Act is all about. And it's a very narrow piece of legislation. It's just on stablecoins.
Interesting. So I know with banks, for example, obviously the reserve requirements for banks is uber important. It's something that we learned a very hard lesson on after the bank runs in 29. It's okay, banks can't loan out all of this money that people deposit in here, because if a lot of people want to come and get their money, we can have a bank run. How would you explain what reserve requirements look like in the crypto and stablecoin scene compared to like a traditional bank?
So this is another kind of ironic thing, because people's perception is that banks are super safe, and stablecoins, because they're on crypto rails, are super risky. And the reality is that bank reserve requirements, I mean, Jeff, you chime in here, isn't it like...
It's 10%, but it's no bank is at 10%.
Yeah,
no bank is at 10%, but it's about 10.
You saying they're higher,
but
Jeff?
They're high. Yeah, they're much higher. Yeah.
Okay.
And they were much higher in like 08, 09 aftermath.
But so legally, a bank you deposit your money, they only have to keep 10% of it on hand to return when people want to make withdrawals on their money. The rest of it they can loan out to make money on. What do you think most banks' reserve requirements actually are? So legally, it's 10%.
Yeah,
I'm asking.
Legally, it's 10%.
Answer.
I think like internally, banks probably want to keep 15 to 20. I would say, but then part of that is the reserve requirement is reserves at the Fed relative to your deposits, but they'll often keep liquid assets, bonds, securities that they can easily liquidate, right? But like the loan portion is usually not going to be multiples of the deposits. Loan to deposits of 100%, 110% would be a lot for a bank, but certainly that's plausible.
Yeah. And so with stable coins, it's 100%. That's my understanding. In other words, every dollar, every digital dollar, or every stable coin has to have an actual dollar backing it. Now, it's often not dollars. It could also be, it could also be government bonds.
But it seems like it's almost always government bonds, right? Because you're not just going to not earn interest. It's like in T-bills and stuff, right?
Typically. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there do have to be a certain number of dollars, but it's government bonds, which is, about as close to the same thing as you can get.
Mm-hmm. So when we make this comparison to banks, whenever we think of banks as something I explain to clients a lot of times, like banks are a business. They're trying to make a profit. You mentioned the Ethereum Foundation earlier. You mentioned kind of who runs stable coins and kind of that process. Do these companies or whoever make these stable coins, are they trying to run a business to earn a profit like a bank, or how's their thought process?
Well, so we got to differentiate between the two, right? Ethereum is a blockchain. Mm-hmm. You can build things like stable coins on Ethereum or on Solana or on numerous other blockchains, right? The Ethereum Foundation is a nonprofit, and their mandate is to really steward the development of Ethereum. So they don't really run Ethereum. They have a lot of influence. If we think about stable coins, that is a type of product that's built on a blockchain, and there are several companies that have stablecoin operations, right? The biggest ones are Tether, or the biggest names you hear are Tether and Circle. And they are absolutely there to make a profit. In fact, one of the things that is going to happen in the United States is that likely every single bank, all the main brokerage firms, they're going to issue their own stablecoin. Because there is profit to be made. Now, how do they make a profit?
Yeah.
Well, like if you deposit dollars, or essentially you buy stable coins, right? They receive those dollars. They go out and they, buy T-bills. They hold the T-bills and they collect the interest on those T-bills. Now, this is kind of an interesting point, is what's the business case for this? So Tether, who is the largest stablecoin issuer, primarily outside of the US, they are, I think they're making insane amounts of money. They're also, just for some perspective, I think last year, Tether was the 5th largest buyer of government bonds.
Oh, wow.
Compared to countries.
Yeah.
And if you rank them with countries, they're the 18th largest holder of U.S. debt right now.
There's a cool slide from Bitwise that shows holders of U.S. treasuries and where the stablecoin market is, and it's in the top 10 of holders of treasuries.
Yeah. And I mean, I've heard estimates from analysts that by 2030, stablecoins will be the largest holder of U.S. debt. We can get into the macroeconomic and geopolitical implications of that because they're very important. But before we even go there, just to understand the business case, in the U.S., what is likely to happen is that these stablecoins, at least U.S.-based stablecoins, eventually just start paying interest. And it's going to drive the margins down to zero in the United States. Why is that? Well, because the U.S. is probably the most efficient financial system in the world in terms of not just the financial system, but the regulatory environment, the enforcement, the certainty that you have that these transactions are legitimate. So we haven't talked about what stablecoins do in the efficiency, but let's say we get the efficiency in the U.S. from 90 to 95%. That's good, but it's not like a game changer for people. If you're in the rest of the world, if you're in a country in Central Africa that's at 20% efficiency and you get it to 50%, they don't care about the interest on their stablecoins. They're getting access to the dollar-based banking system. And that's really where I think the money is going to be made on these. So like Tether, for example, they're making a ton of money, but most of the stablecoins that they issue are being sold to people outside of the United States that just need access to the dollar, and they're not paying interest on it. I think in the US, because it's so much more competitive, stablecoin issues here are going to have to pay interest.
So Jaime, walk us through how they would use that, how they would use those stable coins to like transact. Then if somebody is in Afghanistan, for instance, and they buy stable coins backed by US treasuries, it's not like they can then go exchange that for dollars and then transact. They would have to use the stable coins to transact for goods and services for it to kind of perform that purpose, right? Is that something that they're able to do? Or is this really just a transfer mechanism and, a medium of value to hold?
So there's several ways, like let's just walk through a scenario. If you're a woman in Afghanistan, you can download a crypto app on your phone and maybe get paid for services in stable coins, right? So you're washing someone's clothes and you say, I pay me $1 a week, but I want you to pay me via this app in stable coins, right? And the way you would access that there, there's numerous ways, but there's probably an exchange that you can operate in Afghanistan, and you convert the currency and you convert it to dollar-backed stablecoins, and so they're getting paid and they have access to that. Let's say they lose their phone, or ultimately they just need to know the private key to transact. They can flee the country, and get access to those dollars somewhere else. Now, they probably could transact in stablecoins some places, but the reality is that, let's say, okay, they flee, they go to Europe, and then in Europe, they open up a Coinbase account, transfer their stablecoins into the Coinbase account and redeem them for dollars, or exchange them into euros or whatever. That's kind of how that would play out.
So you mentioned efficiency there, and I want to jump to market economy and effects here, and I know we're running long. So how would you quickly describe or explain what you meant by that efficiency earlier? You said 90 to 95% efficiency.
Yeah, this is a really good thing for everybody involved, because what you're essentially doing with stablecoins is you're taking this payment system, the digital dollar, and you're putting it on rails that are much cheaper and faster to transact in. So if we compare that to what we're stepping away from, which is the SWIFT system, this is a system that's costly. It was developed in the 70s and 80s. It takes a long time to transact, particularly in overseas transactions. So I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it's T+3, T+1. Really, T plus anything is too long in the digital age. Why? If two parties are making a financial transaction, why does that money need to sit somewhere for a couple of days? And so if you take out that time, you're also taking out cost and you're taking out counterparty risk, because for very, very large transactions, counterparty risk is a big deal. The other party could go bankrupt and not pay you. There's also, for cross-dollar purchases, there's currency risk, right? What if the currency really fluctuates before that transaction settles? And then finally, if your receivables are tied up in a payment system, so you think about a really large organization, those are funds that are not in your working capital, funds that you're not able to deploy to build your business, hire people, whatever. So that alone brings a bunch of capital back into the system, and that would have an immediate impact. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're just taking the current system, we're making it better, we're bringing it to the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think something too that we don't fully appreciate living in America is how non-transparent and how corrupt some of the financial systems are in places like Africa or in some parts of Asia. And so, this really is a huge benefit to be able to have something like that that's a lot more efficient, that you can be a lot more confident and have faith in the financial system. And that just invites and incentivizes all of this other development, right? And I think that is, to Jaime's point, one of the reasons that America succeeds so much relative to other countries is we kind of just establish the rules and then kind of let it go and make sure everyone has faith in the underlying system. And when everyone has that, then everyone can be really confident in it and do the things they need to do. So I can certainly see how this would be huge for places like that need a completely new monetary system with zero government involvement.
Yeah, and so don't get me wrong, there are very significant benefits to Americans and to people in the current monetary system. But for the people outside the current monetary system, the benefits are just enormous. Not to mention the fact that now they can do commerce all over the world. You can be in Africa and you can provide some service and get paid, and the other person doesn't have to worry about being scammed, at least not as much.
Can you pay tariffs with stable coins?
That's a question for another episode. I think.
Okay. I'll save it.
No, I mean, that's a really interesting point that you made there, Jamie, and you too, Jeff, about like, if you want to flee a country and you have a bank account in Afghanistan, you can't, it's hard to get that money out in time to when you might need to flee. So having a digital ID for banking, I think, is a massive game changer for a lot of these people.
And you're just subject to more confiscation too. No questions asked. It's not like they're going to serve you a warrant and freeze your accounts because they accused you of a crime. They'll just freeze it and they'll take it, and then you have no recourse.
Exactly. And although I know we have 8 loyal mappers, I don't know that we have many women in Afghanistan out of our 8. So I guess shifting
if they're
gears,
listening to this podcast, we just gave you the secret to assuming you want to. I mean, I'm sure there are many very happy women in Afghanistan also. So we don't want to overgeneralize.
But my transition there was, what does this mean for us here in the US? What is the impact of this on macroeconomics? I know y'all mentioned kind of trade deficit a little bit as well.
Yeah, so this is actually, for me, the biggest benefit in the United States. I mean, there's all these other benefits as to why this makes the system better for everybody, including Americans. But the real thing that I think people are missing, why is it important that dollar-backed stablecoins are issued outside of the U.S.? Well, we talked about right now, today, Tether is the 18th largest holder of U.S. Treasuries, and last year they were the 5th largest purchaser. And that's including countries. In 2030, there's an analyst at Citibank who said they anticipate the largest holder of U.S. Treasuries being stablecoins. Now, if you just think about this rationally, I'm going to break it down into smaller pieces because not everybody is like a financial nerd like us. But what does that mean if we have all of these stablecoins buying U.S. debt? So if you add a huge buyer of U.S. debt, that is ultimately going to drive down U.S. government bond yields because there's more people buying these bonds. That means to be competitive, they don't have to pay as high of an interest rate. So that also drives down U.S. borrowing costs. That is a huge issue for the United States at the current debt levels because by lowering the interest rate on the U.S. deficit, it makes it much more likely that the U.S. can balance the budget and ultimately pay down its debt. But there's another huge geopolitical benefit, and that's that decentralizing ownership of the U.S. debt means that you don't have one guy like Xi Jinping that can press a button and sell for $400 million of U.S. bonds. And I mean, I'm using China as an example.
That would have been a drop in the bucket, Jamie. 400 million, you're going to need to add several
400 billion.
There we go.
You know what I mean? I feel like I'm in Austin Powers, like $1 billion, and everybody laughs. But the point is, you're decentralizing the ownership of debt, meaning that you don't have big holders of U.S. debt that suddenly can leverage a lot of control over the U.S. financial system, and that is also really important.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what the effect of that is. I think there's a lot of efforts by the administration to try to open up new buyers into U.S. debt because we know that foreign countries, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds in foreign countries, they are overweight U.S. dollars right now, and the dollar's down 10% or so year to date. And so they're down 10% on a lot of their holdings, even if they're treasury bonds that should be safe, they're down. So foreign parties are not allocating as much to U.S. dollars, and so you have to shore that up, especially with, the amount of new issuance of bonds is going up because we continue to have a positive deficit and add on to our debt. So, I think the stablecoin avenue is one of those. There's also a lot of changes to large bank regulation around the supplemental leverage ratio and reclassifying how treasury bonds are classified within the risk asset framework. And so maybe they don't take as much of a capital charge, allowing banks to invest more of their reserves into treasuries. So there's actually a lot of efforts in this direction to try to bring down borrowing costs, including also, maybe getting a new Fed chairman in there that has a different view on the direction of monetary policy.
And so I know you mentioned earlier, Jamie, that the Genius Act. So we're recording here on July 18th. This will probably come out close to the beginning of August. What's the update with the Genius Act? So you mentioned it got passed by Congress, or where are we at?
Yeah. So I want to say maybe 2-3 weeks ago it passed the Senate, and again it took 60 votes, so it passed with bipartisan support. There's a little bit of politicking that went on behind the scenes by a couple of very prominent politicians that just for reasons we don't need to get into are really just anti-crypto. But it passed with bipartisan support, and then the concern was, okay, it's got to go to the House. And if the House passes it, it goes to the president's desk. And there was a big push, like, just pass it as is. Don't modify it. Don't make changes. That didn't happen. The House didn't pass it initially, and it kind of was back and forth. And then we found out yesterday that the House did pass it. A couple weeks went by. But it seemed like it was headed in the other direction, but it passed, and it's going to the president's desk for signature. So I think that is a really good thing for everybody on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, it's basically law at this point. I mean, President Trump is definitely going to sign it. This is a big win. I think, his administration was certainly pushing that. I think, Jamie, to your point, he was probably involved in getting that across the finish line and in the last few stages. And so, yeah, this is basically law at this point.
Well, exciting news. Appreciate both of y'all for giving us these updates. And I say us because I learned a ton today. So I hope the mappers did as well. Go ahead,
can I ask Jeff one quick question? Because he's definitely the economic brains on this podcast. I mean, what do you think? Like, how do you see this impacting bond yields long term and the broader picture of the U.S. deficit? Now, if you add this massive buyer of treasuries,
you would want to think about how much new money is coming into treasuries. There's already a ton of foreign assets and capital that go into treasuries, and that's via a lot of different directions. It's via sovereign wealth funds, it's via bank accounts, brokerage accounts, mutual funds, asset managers, or UCITS in Europe, or whatever they want to call it. So you'd really want to try to figure out what's the additional amount of treasury bonds that are going to be purchased by these stable coins that is not just kind of redirected mutual fund flow or redirected money market flow or what have you. But to that extent, yeah, I mean, sure, the treasury bond market is huge, though. It's $30 trillion and it's growing by $2 trillion every year. So, you talk about 400 million or 400 billion. It's going to take a lot to make a big dent. And then it also depends on there's a lot going on with the treasury issuance of determining, do we want to issue 6-month paper, 1-year paper, 2-year paper, depending on the yields. And right now, a lot of the paper that we've been issuing, about 20%, has been in the front part of the curve, right? And so I think what would need to happen is you would want to, have buyers of U.S. bonds, but probably within these stable coins, they're buying T-bills, not the long-term treasury bonds. And the T-bills are going to be what the new Fed chair can address anyway by dropping the Fed funds rate. So I don't know if there's much to be had there. I mean, really, if you want to lock in the debt at lower rates, you need long-term yields to fall. And the more and more that you have growing deficit, growing interest costs, and growing pressure on the Fed, it actually is causing long-term yields to increase. So, markets are always interesting. There's definitely things that are tailwinds and headwinds, and you always just see the net effect. So I agree that it'll be interesting, but I think with stablecoins probably, more geared toward purchasing the short-term paper, it may not have the effect on the long-term yields that they would like.
Interesting. Well, I think if there's one big takeaway, it's that stablecoins equal freedom, and I think that
is that going to be the name of the episode?
I think if compliance approves it, I think
freedom coin.
Got through some levels. The freedom coin. I like it. All right. Well, I appreciate both of you guys. Jeff, I hope you get some time at the lake. Jamie, school year is right around the corner. You can make it. Our other
hang in there.
Kids,
you got
hang
it.
in there. We're right there.
You're fighting the good fight, Jamie.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Remember, the views expressed are not necessarily those of Beam Wealth Advisors. All content is for educational purposes only and should not be construed as an endorsement of any third party or their views, or as a solicitation or offer to sell securities or provide investment, tax, legal, or consulting services. We believe the information presented to be reliable, but it is not guaranteed for accuracy or completeness. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Hypothetical returns do not reflect actual trading and may not be indicative of the performance of any specific investment. Always consult with a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Additional information, including management fees and expenses, is provided on our Form ADV Part 2, available upon request or at the SEC's Investment Advisor Public Disclosure website, advisorinfo.sec.gov.